The morning briefing at Bagram Air Base fell silent when General Morrison slammed his coffee mug against the metal table, the sound echoing through the prefab structure like a gunshot. Steam rose from the spilled liquid as he glared at the tactical display. Red enemy positions scattered across the Afghan mountainscape like blood drops on snow. His weathered face, carved by 30 years of military service, twisted into a grimace that had terrified junior officers from Kuwait to Korea. "Impossible," he growled, jabbing a thick finger at the elevation readings. "No aircraft, not even those flying bathtubs, can maintain effective fire at that altitude. The terrain's a death trap, and the weather's closing in fast." The storm clouds visible through the reinforced windows seemed to mock his certainty, rolling across the Hindu Kush like gray cavalry charging toward the base. Captain Alina, Reaper, Volkov sat in the back row, her calloused hands folded in her lap, watching the general's theatrical display with the detached interest of someone who'd seen this performance before. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from surviving 127 combat missions in the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a record that most male pilots twice her age couldn't match. Her call sign hadn't come from some Hollywood fantasy, but from her uncanny ability to find targets that others had given up for dead, bringing swift justice to those who thought mountain shadows could hide them forever. The briefing continued with the usual parade of impossibilities. Taliban forces had established a stronghold in the Korangal Valley, a position so well fortified and strategically placed that 3 previous airstrikes had failed to dislodge them. The insurgents controlled a crucial supply route, and every day they remained meant more American lives at risk. The terrain was vertical, the weather was deteriorating, and the minimum safe altitude for attack runs would render most ordnance ineffective against hardened positions. "Sir," Alina's voice cut through the heated discussion like a blade through silk. The room turned toward her, some faces showing curiosity, others barely concealed irritation. She stood slowly, her flight suit bearing the subtle scars of a warrior who'd earned every thread, a small burn mark from emergency egress training, a faded name tape that had seen more combat zones than most generals' careers. Permission to speak freely, her Ukrainian accent, barely detectable after 15 years in America, gave her words a precision that commanded attention. The general's eyes narrowed, but he nodded grudgingly. Alina had that effect on superior officers. They wanted to dismiss her, but her record made that impossible. "The A-10 wasn't designed to fly pretty, sir. It was designed to fly where others can't." She moved toward the tactical display, her movements economical and purposeful. "Those mountains aren't obstacles, they're cover." The morning briefing at Bagram had just become very interesting indeed. Outside, the first drops of an Afghan storm began tapping against bulletproof glass, as if nature itself were keeping time for the conversation that would change everything. The silence stretched taut as piano wire, waiting for someone to make the first cut. Alina's proposal was audacious even by A-10 standards. While other aircraft treated the Korangal Valley's knife-edge ridges and plunging canyons as hazardous obstacles to avoid, she saw them as tactical advantages to exploit. The Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog, for its ungainly appearance and stubborn refusal to die, could fly lower and slower than any other military aircraft in the inventory. What looked like limitations to others were opportunities to someone who understood the machine's true nature. General Morrison's expression shifted from skepticism to grudging interest as Alina traced flight paths on the digital map with her finger. Her route followed terrain features that would be suicide runs for faster jets, threading between peaks at altitudes that would leave little margin for error. "The weather front gives us cover from shoulder-fired missiles," she explained, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was suggesting. "We go in low, use the ridgelines to mask our approach, and hit them before they know we're there." "Captain Volkov," the intelligence officer interjected, his voice tight with concern, "the ceiling's dropping to 800 feet in some areas. That's well below minimum safe altitude for combat operations. He was a competent analyst, but Alina could see he'd never felt an aircraft shudder through mountain thermals or watched tracer fire arc past his canopy close enough to count the rounds. Alina's laugh held no humor. Safe altitude is a relative concept when people are shooting at you, sir. The warthog doesn't care about your comfort zone. She'd learned that lesson over the deserts of Iraq, where staying high and safe meant watching helplessly as ground forces took casualties she could have prevented. The A-10's titanium bathtub cockpit and redundant systems weren't just engineering marvels. They were promises kept to the soldiers below who needed her most. The room's atmosphere grew heavy with unspoken questions. Military culture demanded respect for chain of command, but it also recognized expertise when it wore captain's bars and spoke with the quiet authority of proven combat experience. Alina had never been one for military politics or careful career maneuvering. She flew for the soldiers on the ground, period. Everything else was just paperwork and posturing. "How low are we talking, Captain?" The question came from Colonel Hayes, the air operations commander whose opinion carried significant weight. His weathered face showed genuine curiosity rather than dismissive doubt, the look of a combat veteran recognizing another's expertise. Alina's answer came without hesitation. "Deck level, low enough to read their facial expressions before we light them up." The metaphor wasn't entirely figurative. She'd flown missions where the enemy was close enough to see individual expressions through her targeting pod. Those memories lived behind her eyes like archived footage, ready to play whenever doubt crept in about what needed to be done. The general's silence stretched longer now, his strategic mind weighing tactical audacity against operational risk. "You realize," General Morrison said finally, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension like a chainsaw through timber, "that what you're describing violates every safety protocol we've established for mountain operations." His words carried weight, but Alina detected something else beneath the surface, professional curiosity warring with institutional caution. The general had earned his stars through calculated risks, but this proposal pushed far beyond anything in the playbook. Alina nodded slowly, understanding the subtext perfectly. Military careers had been destroyed over far less controversial decisions, and she was essentially asking for permission to attempt something that could easily end in court-martial proceedings if it went wrong. But soldiers were dying while they debated protocol, and that reality outweighed any personal consequences she might face. "Yes, sir, I do. But respectfully, those protocols were written by people who never flew an A-10 in anger." Her words carried the quiet conviction of someone who'd tested those limits repeatedly and survived to question their validity. The Warthog isn't bound by the same physics as other aircraft. She's designed to absorb punishment that would drop anything else from the sky. The intelligence briefing photos showed the Taliban positions in brutal detail, bunkers carved into living rock, firing positions with interlocking fields of fire, and enough heavy weapons to turn the valley into a killing field for any conventional approach. Previous bombing runs had barely scratched the surface, leaving the insurgents emboldened and increasingly aggressive in their attacks on coalition supply convoys. "Walk me through it," Colonel Hayes commanded, his tone shifting from skeptical to professionally interested. Alina moved to the tactical display, her movements precise despite the weight of every eye in the room tracking her progress. She'd done this briefing in her head dozens of times during sleepless nights, refining approaches and contingencies until the mission plan lived in her muscle memory. "Phase 1, she began, tracing the initial approach vector. "We use the storm front as concealment, flying nap of the Earth through this canyon system." Her finger followed a serpentine path that would take the aircraft through terrain features that lesser pilots would consider impossible. "The radar shadow from these ridges means we're invisible until we're already inside their perimeter." The room leaned forward almost unconsciously, drawn into the tactical narrative despite their reservations. Alina continued mapping the mission profile, her voice gaining confidence as she detailed how the A-10's unique capabilities could turn the valley's geography from obstacle into weapon. The Thunderbolt II's ability to fly slow and low, to loiter over targets while absorbing damage that would cripple other aircraft, transformed impossible terrain into the perfect hunting ground. Time on target. General Morrison's question was professional, focused, the inquiry of a commander considering real possibilities rather than dismissing theoretical impossibilities. Alina's answer came without hesitation. 17 minutes from Wheels Up to Winchester. Winchester, the radio call indicating all ordnance expended. 17 minutes to solve a problem that had frustrated coalition forces for months. The morning briefing had evolved into something none of them had expected when they'd gathered over lukewarm coffee and intelligence reports. Outside, the storm continued building, but inside the prefab structure, a different kind of weather system was taking shape. Alina could feel the shift in the room's energy, skepticism giving way to grudging possibility, institutional caution wrestling with operational necessity. "Captain," the general said, his voice carrying decades of command authority, "you understand that if this goes sideways, you're not just risking your own life. Mission failure means those Taliban positions remain active, supply convoys keep getting hit, and soldiers keep dying." His words weren't threats. They were the brutal calculus of military leadership, where every decision carried consequences measured in human lives. Alina met his stare without flinching. "Sir, with respect, soldiers are already dying. They're dying because we're fighting this war like gentlemen, while the enemy fights it like they mean to win." Her response carried the frustration of every pilot who'd been forced to watch helplessly while arbitrary restrictions prevented them from doing their job effectively. The silence that followed was different from before, not the awkward pause of dismissed suggestions, but the pregnant quiet of minds recalculating previously accepted limitations. Alina had touched something fundamental about the nature of asymmetric warfare, the mismatch between institutional procedure and battlefield reality that had frustrated military professionals since the beginning of organized conflict. "What's your fuel and ordnance loadout?" Colonel Hayes asked, his question indicating serious consideration rather than theoretical discussion. Alina felt her pulse quicken. They were actually listening, actually weighing her proposal against the alternatives. Reduced fuel for extended loiter time, mixed ordnance package, Mavericks for hardened targets, 30mm for personnel, and sufficient ammunition for multiple passes if required. She'd already calculated the loadout to maximize effectiveness while maintaining the power-to-weight ratio necessary for extreme low-altitude operations. The tactical discussion that followed was detailed and professional, with Alina answering technical questions that demonstrated her thorough understanding of both aircraft capabilities and mission requirements. The room's initial skepticism had transformed into engaged analysis, with experienced officers recognizing the difference between reckless bravado and calculated audacity based on genuine expertise. General Morrison stood slowly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor with a sound like finality itself. "Captain Volkov," he said, his tone carrying the weight of momentous decisions, "you have one opportunity to prove your theory. One flight, full mission parameters, with the understanding that failure isn't just career-ending, it's potentially war-losing." The words hung in the recycled air like smoke from distant battles, carrying implications that extended far beyond one captain's unconventional proposal. 30 minutes later, Alina stood on the flight line beside her A-10, rain pelting her flight suit as ground crews completed final preparations. The Thunderbolt II looked exactly like what it was, a flying gun wrapped in titanium armor and stubborn determination. Unlike sleek fighters that embodied aerial elegance, the Warthog wore its utilitarian brutality like a badge of honor, every line and surface optimized for one purpose: bringing precise violence to those who threatened American ground forces. Her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez completed the pre-flight inspection with the methodical thoroughness that separated competent maintenance personnel from those who got pilots killed. "She's ready, ma'am," he shouted over the wind, his words barely audible above the storm's increasing intensity. "All systems green, ordnance loaded and safed, fuel topped off." Alina nodded, pulling on her helmet and feeling the familiar weight settle onto her shoulders like an old friend's embrace. The HUD display flickered to life, painting flight parameters across her vision in ghostly green numbers that had guided her through more combat missions than she cared to count. Every switch and control lived beneath her fingertips with the intimate familiarity that came from countless hours of training and operational experience. The radio crackled to life as she completed engine start procedures. "Reaper 1-1, this is Tower. Weather's marginal VFR, ceiling 800 and dropping. Winds gusting to 35 knots with moderate to severe turbulence reported in the valley approaches. Confirm you're proceeding with mission as planned." Tower, Reaper 1-1. Roger, all weather advisories. Mission proceeds as briefed. Alina's response was calm, professional, betraying none of the adrenaline beginning to surge through her system. This was the moment when theoretical became real, when months of frustration and institutional friction crystallized into action. The A-10's twin General Electric turbofans spooled up with their characteristic whine, a sound that had become synonymous with salvation for ground troops across multiple theaters of operation. Alina advanced the throttles and felt 17,000 pounds of flying tank begin rolling toward the active runway, every vibration transmitting itself through the airframe into her bones. Bagram Tower, Reaper 1-1 requesting takeoff clearance for immediate departure, tactical routing authorized. The formalities of controlled flight were about to give way to the chaos of combat aviation, where regulations became suggestions and survival trumped procedure every time. Reaper 1-1, cleared for takeoff. Good hunting. The tower controller's final transmission carried more than professional courtesy. It held the hopes of everyone who understood what Alina was attempting. The takeoff roll seemed to last forever, the heavily loaded A-10 requiring every foot of runway before finally clawing its way into the storm-darkened sky. Alina banked hard left after takeoff, immediately dropping to nap-of-the-earth altitude as the terrain rose to meet her aircraft like a living thing. The mountains of Afghanistan stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds that promised both concealment and potential catastrophe. She'd flown these valleys before, but never at this altitude, never with this much riding on precise execution of an untested tactical approach. The A-10's flight characteristics at extreme low altitude were familiar but unforgiving. Every gust of wind translated into control inputs. Every thermal updraft or downdraft demanded immediate compensation. The aircraft's inherent stability, designed for accurate weapons delivery under combat conditions, became both asset and liability when threading between ridgelines with minimal clearance margins. Bagram Control, Reaper 1-1 entering tactical operations area, going secure comms. Alina switched to encrypted frequencies, her last formal contact with the safety of controlled airspace. From this point forward, she was essentially alone, guided only by her instruments, experience, and the GPS coordinates of targets that might or might not still be where intelligence reports claimed. The valley approach required a series of knife-edge turns between rock faces that seemed impossibly close, the A-10's wingspan clearing obstacles by margins measured in feet, rather than the hundreds of yards that safety regulations demanded. Alina's hands moved across controls with practiced precision, making continuous microadjustments to heading and altitude that kept the aircraft precisely on the razor-thin corridor between mission success and catastrophic failure. Visibility dropped further as she penetrated deeper into the storm system, the world outside her canopy becoming a gray void, punctuated by fleeting glimpses of terrain features that appeared and vanished like ghosts. The HUD overlay became her primary reference, synthetic vision, painting a digital representation of reality across her field of view in amber lines and symbols that had become more familiar than the physical world they represented. Target area in sight, she announced to herself, a verbal checkpoint that helped maintain situational awareness during high-stress operations. The Taliban positions revealed themselves gradually through the murk, first as suspicious geometric shapes that didn't belong in natural terrain, then as clearly man-made fortifications that represented weeks or months of careful preparation. Alina's targeting pod locked onto the primary bunker complex, its thermal imaging revealing heat signatures that confirmed active enemy presence. The moment of truth had arrived. 17 minutes from takeoff to Winchester was about to begin. The first pass required delicate timing, approaching the target complex from an angle that maximized surprise while minimizing exposure to defensive fires. Alina descended even further, the A-10 now flying so low that individual rocks and boulders were clearly visible through the canopy. The altimeter reading seemed impossible, altitude measurements that would constitute a controlled crash for most aircraft were simply another day at the office for a properly flown Thunderbolt II. Master arm on, selecting Maverick, she announced to the empty cockpit, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The AGM-65 air-to-ground missile seeker head locked onto the primary target, its infrared guidance system painting the bunker complex with invisible energy that would guide precision death to precisely the right location. The first Maverick launched with its characteristic whoosh and smoke trail, followed immediately by aggressive defensive maneuvering as Alina threw the A-10 into a hard banking turn that used the valley walls themselves as shield against potential return fire. The missile's impact came seconds later, a brilliant flash followed by secondary explosions that indicated stored ammunition or fuel had been ignited. But Alina wasn't finished. The mission profile called for multiple passes, systematic destruction of the entire complex using a combination of missiles and cannon fire that would leave nothing functional for enemy use. She pulled the aircraft around in a punishing high-G turn, setting up for the second attack run while evaluating battle damage from the first strike. The Taliban positions were definitely occupied and actively defended. Muzzle flashes from small arms fire were visible through the targeting pod, though at this altitude and in these weather conditions, the chances of effective hits were minimal. Alina felt the familiar calm that came during combat operations, adrenaline sharpening her focus, while training and experience provided the framework for split-second decision-making. Run 2, selecting gun, she announced, lining up for a strafing pass with the GAU-A-10 Avenger 30 cannon that formed the A-10's primary armament. The 7-barrel Gatling gun was capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute, enough firepower to destroy tanks, let alone personnel positions carved from rock. The cannon's distinctive sound, a deep, throaty growl that had earned it the nickname BRRT among ground troops, filled the cockpit as Alina walked explosive rounds across the target area with methodical precision. The strafing run lasted exactly 2.3 seconds, but in that brief time span Alina's cannon delivered sufficient firepower to suppress or destroy any remaining resistance in the primary target area. The A-10 climbed away from the target in a spiraling ascent that used the terrain to mask its withdrawal, smoke and dust marking the location of what had been an impregnable Taliban stronghold just minutes earlier. Reaper 1-1, mission complete. Winchester on primary targets, all systems nominal, returning to base. Alina's transmission to Bagram control was matter-of-fact, professional, giving no indication of the significance of what had just been accomplished. The radio discipline that had been drilled into her throughout flight training maintained its hold even in moments of personal triumph. But as she turned toward home, Alina allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The impossible mission had become possible through a combination of aircraft capability, pilot skill, and the kind of tactical audacity that military institutions both feared and occasionally needed. The Taliban positions that had frustrated coalition forces for months were now smoking craters, and the supply convoys would roll again without fear of ambush from that particular location. The return flight to Bagram gave Alina time to process what had just happened, both tactically and professionally. She'd proven that conventional wisdom wasn't always wise, that institutional limitations weren't necessarily absolute, and that sometimes the most effective solutions came from questioning assumptions that everyone else accepted without examination. But more importantly, she demonstrated something about the A-10 itself, that this ungainly, much-maligned aircraft could perform missions that were theoretically impossible for any fixed-wing platform. The Thunderbolt II's unique combination of durability, firepower, and low-altitude performance made it capable of tactical applications that existed nowhere in official doctrine or training manuals. The landing at Bagram was routine, almost anticlimactic after the intensity of combat operations. Alina rolled out on the runway and taxied to the parking area where ground crews waited to inspect the aircraft for battle damage and prepare it for the next mission. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez was there, as always, ready to receive his aircraft back from another successful combat sortie. "How'd she run, ma'am?" Rodriguez asked as Alina completed shutdown procedures, his question carrying professional interest in both pilot and aircraft performance. The relationship between aircrew and maintenance personnel was built on mutual respect and shared responsibility. Pilots trusted their lives to mechanical systems, while crew chiefs took personal pride in keeping those systems operating under impossible conditions. "Like a Swiss watch, Sergeant. She did everything we asked and came home to tell about it." Alina's response was accurate but understated. The A-10 had performed flawlessly under conditions that would have challenged far more sophisticated aircraft. The post-flight debrief took place in the same conference room where the morning briefing had begun, but the atmosphere was completely different now. General Morrison reviewed Alina's mission report with the focused attention of a commander studying tactical innovations that might change established doctrine. Within hours of Alina's return, radio intercepts confirmed the mission's effectiveness beyond any doubt. Taliban communications were filled with shocked reports of the stronghold's destruction, confusion about how coalition aircraft had managed to penetrate their carefully prepared defenses, and urgent requests for guidance from higher-level commanders who had considered the position impregnable. "Captain Volkov," General Morrison said, his tone carrying grudging respect, "it appears your unconventional approach has solved a problem that conventional methods couldn't touch. I'm authorizing immediate expansion of this tactical concept to other problem areas in the theater." Alina nodded professionally, but inside she felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. She'd proven that thinking outside established parameters could produce results that traditional approaches couldn't achieve. More importantly, she demonstrated that the A-10's unique capabilities made it irreplaceable for certain missions, regardless of what budget analysts or acquisition specialists might claim. The ripple effects of that single mission would extend far beyond one successful strike in an Afghan valley. Alina's tactical innovation would be studied, refined, and eventually incorporated into official doctrine as the Volkov method. Low-altitude precision strikes using terrain masking and weather concealment to achieve tactical surprise. But the immediate consequence was simpler and more personal. Soldiers would come home alive who might otherwise have died, convoy routes would reopen, and the mission would continue with one less obstacle in the path toward eventual success. That night, Alina sat in her quarters writing the mission report that would document exactly how an impossible flight had become routine, transforming institutional skepticism into tactical advantage through nothing more than professional competence and the refusal to accept limitations that others considered absolute. The storm that had provided concealment for her mission was breaking up, revealing stars that had been hidden behind clouds for days. Alina looked up at that vast Afghan sky and thought about all the missions yet to fly, all the problems yet to solve, and all the soldiers who would depend on her willingness to push beyond what others considered possible. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the flight line, already being prepared for tomorrow's missions by ground crews who understood that their meticulous work enabled tactical miracles. The aircraft's battle-scarred exterior told stories of previous missions, previous victories, previous moments when the difference between possible and impossible had been measured in pilot skill and mechanical reliability. Alina's call sign, Reaper, would take on new meaning after this mission. No longer just a reference to her ability to find and destroy targets that others had given up for dead, it now represented something larger, the inevitable consequence of combining superior training, superior equipment, and the warrior's refusal to accept defeat when American lives hung in the balance. 3 weeks after Alina's Valley mission, the tactical revolution she'd initiated was spreading throughout the theater of operations. Her technique, using extreme low-altitude approaches combined with terrain masking and weather concealment, had been successfully adapted by other A-10 pilots facing similar challenges with heavily defended targets in mountainous terrain. The results were undeniable. Mission success rates increased dramatically. Friendly casualties from enemy ambushes dropped to nearly zero in areas where the Volkov method was employed, and Taliban communications intercepted by intelligence assets showed increasing frustration with coalition air power's newfound ability to strike previously safe positions. But success bred new challenges. As word of Alina's innovations spread beyond Afghanistan, requests began arriving from other theaters of operation where similar tactical problems demanded similar solutions. The bureaucratic machinery that had initially resisted her unconventional approach now wanted to systematize and export it, transforming battlefield innovation into official doctrine through the same institutional processes that had initially opposed it. Captain, Colonel Hayes announced during the weekly air operations briefing, Higher Headquarters wants you to develop a formal training program for precision low-altitude strikes. They're talking about making this a standard technique for the entire A-10 community. Alina felt the familiar tension between innovation and institutionalization, between the fluid creativity required for tactical success and the rigid structure necessary for military organization. Her technique worked precisely because it adapted to specific conditions rather than following predetermined procedures. Turning it into standardized doctrine might eliminate the very flexibility that made it effective. "Sir," she replied carefully, "what works in these mountains might not work in desert or jungle environments. The technique requires constant adaptation based on terrain, weather, and enemy capabilities." Her concern was professional rather than personal. She'd seen too many battlefield innovations lose their effectiveness once they became routine procedures applied without regard to changing conditions. The bureaucratic pressure was understandable. Military institutions existed to transform individual excellence into organizational capability, to ensure that tactical innovations survived beyond the careers of their inventors. But Alina recognized the inherent danger in over-systematizing approaches that depended on pilot judgment and situational awareness for their effectiveness. Her solution was characteristically practical. Rather than developing rigid procedures, she would train other pilots to think through the same analytical processes she used to adapt basic concepts to specific mission requirements. The goal wasn't to create cookie-cutter replicas of her Valley mission, but to develop pilots who could improvise similar solutions when faced with comparable challenges. The training program Alina developed emphasized decision-making over procedure following, teaching pilots to evaluate terrain, weather, and enemy factors in order to develop custom approaches for each unique situation. Over the following months, Alina found herself traveling throughout Southwest Asia, demonstrating her techniques to A-10 squadrons facing their own tactical challenges. Each deployment revealed new applications for the basic concept of using the aircraft's unique capabilities to overcome conventional limitations. In Iraq's urban environments, she showed pilots how to use the A-10's slow speed and precise maneuvering to provide close air support in situations where faster jets couldn't safely operate. In Syria's complex airspace, she demonstrated techniques for avoiding surface-to-air missiles while maintaining the low altitude necessary for accurate target identification. Each mission added to her growing reputation as the pilot who could solve unsolvable problems, but Alina remained focused on the practical rather than the professional. Her motivation hadn't changed since that first Valley mission. Soldiers on the ground needed effective air support, and she possessed the skills necessary to provide it regardless of institutional obstacles or conventional wisdom. The personal cost of constant deployment was significant. Alina's quarters at Bagram became a temporary way station between missions rather than anything resembling home. Relationships became impossible to maintain across time zones and operational security requirements. The warrior's path had always demanded sacrifice, but the price seemed to increase with each successful mission. Yet she continued, driven by the knowledge that her skills could save lives that would otherwise be lost to bureaucratic caution or institutional inflexibility. Every mission report that documented another successful, impossible strike validated her belief that military effectiveness required constant questioning of accepted limitations. The letters from ground units were what sustained her through the isolation and exhaustion. Tank crews wrote to thank her for destroying anti-armor positions that had pinned them down for days. Infantry commanders described convoy routes that were safe again, because key enemy positions no longer existed. Medevac pilots reported successful extractions from areas that had previously been too dangerous to approach. Alina kept these letters in a worn folder that traveled with her from base to base, a tangible reminder of why the mission mattered more than personal comfort or career advancement. Each letter represented lives saved, families that would remain intact, soldiers who would return home because someone had been willing to push beyond what others considered possible. By the end of her deployment, Alina's tactical innovations had been integrated into standard A-10 training curricula throughout the Air Force. Her techniques were being taught to new pilots as established procedures rather than experimental approaches, ensuring that future generations would have access to capabilities that had been considered impossible just months earlier. The transformation was complete, but Alina remained unchanged, still the competent professional who flew for the soldiers below rather than the generals above, still the pilot who refused to accept institutional limitations when mission requirements demanded creative solutions. Her final mission in Afghanistan was almost routine by then. Another impossible target in another inaccessible location. Another application of techniques that had become standard rather than revolutionary. But as Alina lined up for her final strafing run in Afghan airspace, she understood that the real victory wasn't tactical or professional. The victory was cultural. An institution had learned to question its own assumptions, to value battlefield innovation over bureaucratic procedure, to recognize that sometimes the most junior member of the team possessed insights that senior leadership needed to hear. Alina's legacy wouldn't be measured in targets destroyed or missions completed, but in the changed mindset that made future innovations possible. When Alina's transport lifted off from Bagram for the final time, she carried with her something more valuable than medals or commendations. The knowledge that military effectiveness could be improved through the simple act of refusing to accept limitations that others considered absolute. The A-10s on the flight line below would continue flying missions that had been impossible before her innovations made them routine. Future pilots would push boundaries she hadn't even discovered yet, Following the example she'd set through professional competence rather than institutional rebellion. Years later, when military historians wrote about the evolution of close air support doctrine in the 21st century, they would identify specific missions as turning points in tactical development. But Alina knew the real transformation had been more fundamental. An organization had learned that its greatest asset wasn't advanced technology or superior firepower, but the willingness to adapt established procedures when mission requirements demanded innovation. The warrior's code she'd followed throughout her career was simple: accomplish the mission, take care of your people, and never accept defeat when victory remains possible through superior effort or creative thinking. Alina had lived that code in Afghan valleys and Iraqi cities, in Syrian airspace and countless training exercises where the only enemy was institutional inertia. Her call sign, Reaper, would become legend among A-10 pilots, not because of any single dramatic mission, but because of consistent professional excellence applied to problems that others had considered unsolvable. The real reaping hadn't been enemy positions or Taliban strongholds, but the harvest of possibility that came from refusing to accept artificial limitations. Alina's story became part of Air Force culture, passed down through generations of pilots who learned that military effectiveness required constant questioning of established doctrine. Her techniques were refined and adapted to new threats and changing conditions, but the underlying principle remained constant. Superior training and equipment meant nothing without the warrior's willingness to push beyond comfortable limitations. The general who had initially claimed no jet could fly that low eventually became one of Alina's strongest advocates, recommending her innovations for implementation throughout the Air Force. His transformation from skeptic to supporter illustrated the broader cultural change that Alina's example had initiated, an institution learning to value battlefield results over bureaucratic comfort. In the end, Alina's legacy wasn't about flying low or hitting impossible targets. It was about demonstrating that military effectiveness required constant adaptation, professional competence applied without regard to conventional limitations, and the warrior's fundamental commitment to mission accomplishment regardless of institutional obstacles. The sky above Afghanistan had witnessed countless acts of courage and innovation, but few had generated consequences as lasting as one captain's refusal to accept that certain missions were impossible. Alina had proven that with sufficient skill, determination, and creative thinking, the only real limitations were those imposed by failure of imagination rather than failure of capability. Her story would inspire future generations of military aviators to question established doctrine, to seek innovative solutions to tactical challenges, and to remember that sometimes the most effective approach was the one that everyone else considered impossible, until someone proved them wrong through superior execution and unwavering commitment to mission success.